In the unforgiving peaks of Alaska's Denali Range, a father and son embarked on what should have been a routine winter expedition. But when a catastrophic storm trapped them at an altitude where temperatures plummeted to 69 degrees 6, their survival skills were pushed to the absolute limit. For 9 days, they battled frostbite, dwindling supplies, and the crushing weight of isolation. But on the 10th day, something happened that defied all expectations, an event that would test not just their physical endurance, but the very bond between them. This is their story. If you enjoy these kinds of survival stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Michael Torres had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. At 42, the former Marine and wilderness guide had summited countless peaks across North America, but Denali's West Buttress route in deep winter remained his white whale. Standing at the trailhead in Talkeetna, Alaska, on a frigid January morning, he adjusted his pack and looked at his 17-year-old son, David. "You ready for this?" Michael asked, his breath crystallizing in the -30 air. David nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his hazel eyes. The teenager had always been more comfortable with books than backpacks, preferring chess tournaments to camping trips. But after his parents' divorce 2 years earlier, these expeditions had become their way of rebuilding what had fractured. David had trained for 6 months, running stairs, practicing ice climbing at the local gym, studying survival manuals until his eyes burned. "I'm ready, Dad," he said, tightening the straps on his crimson parka. They began their ascent under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The January sun hung low on the horizon, offering light but no warmth. Their crampons bit into the hard-packed snow as they navigated the lower glacier, following the route Michael had memorized from dozens of maps and satellite images. The first 3 days passed without incident. They established Camp 1 at 7,800 feet, their tent a small orange dome against an endless white landscape. Inside, they huddled over a portable stove, melting snow for water and rehydrating freeze-dried meals. Michael watched his son's face glow in the flickering light, saw how David's initial nervousness had given way to something like wonder. "I get it now," David said, spooning beef stew into his mouth. "Why you love this so much." "Yeah?" Michael smiled. "What do you get?" "Out here, everything's simple. There's no homework, no arguments about college, no mom texting me to ask if you're feeding me properly." David paused. "It's just us against the mountain. Either we're strong enough or we're not." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. His ex-wife, Jennifer, had warned him about this trip. "He's 17, not some hardened climber," she'd said during their last phone call. "What are you trying to prove?" But Michael wasn't trying to prove anything. He was trying to give his son something solid, something real in a world that seemed increasingly virtual and disconnected. By day 4, they reached Camp 2 at 11,200 feet. The weather remained stable, but the cold intensified with every 100 feet of elevation. At night, even inside their sleeping bags rated for -40, they shivered. Michael could hear David's teeth chattering in the darkness. "Talk to me," Michael said. "Keep your mind active." "About what?" "Anything. Tell me about that girl you mentioned. Emma, right?" David laughed, the sound muffled by his balaclava. "She's just a friend, Dad. We're in the same AP history class." "Just a friend who you text every night? How do you—" "Never mind." David was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, okay. I like her. But she probably thinks I'm crazy for doing this trip. If she's worth your time, she'll think you're brave," Michael said. They fell into silence, listening to the wind beginning to pick up outside their tent. Michael checked his weather radio. A low-pressure system was forming to the west, but it wasn't expected to hit for another 48 hours. They had time. Day 5 brought the first signs of trouble. The temperature dropped to -55 Celsius, and the wind picked up to 30 miles per hour. The combination created a wind chill that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. They spent the day acclimatizing at Camp 2, venturing out only to cache supplies for their summit push. During one supply run, David stumbled on a patch of ice. Michael caught him before he fell, but not before David's gloved hand scraped against a jagged rock outcropping. When they returned to the tent, David removed his glove to find his palm bleeding. "It's nothing," David insisted, as Michael cleaned the wound with antiseptic. "Nothing gets infected up here," Michael said, wrapping the cut with sterile gauze. "We take care of every injury, no matter how small." That night, the wind became violent. It hammered their tent with such force that Michael wondered if the stakes would hold. He lay awake, one hand on the tent pole, ready to brace it if necessary. Beside him, David had finally fallen asleep, his breathing steady despite the chaos outside. Michael thought about Jennifer's words again. Was this reckless? Had he let his ego override his judgment? But then he remembered David's face when they'd summited their first 14er together in Colorado. The pure joy, the pride, the sense that he'd accomplished something that mattered. That was what Michael was chasing, not glory, but connection. Day 6 dawned with ominous skies. The low-pressure system had accelerated, arriving 18 hours ahead of schedule. Michael made the call that would save their lives. They would descend immediately, abandoning the summit attempt. "But we're so close," David protested. "And we'll stay alive to try again," Michael said firmly. "Rule number 1, the mountain will always be here. We might not be." They broke camp in under an hour, packing with the efficiency that came from experience and adrenaline. The descent should have been straightforward. Retrace their route to Camp 1, then down to base camp. But as they began their journey downward, the storm hit with terrifying speed. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. The wind roared at 60 miles per hour, strong enough to knock David off his feet. Snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Michael clipped a safety line between them, ensuring they wouldn't be separated. "Stay close!" he shouted, but the wind tore his words away. They made it less than a mile before Michael realized they were in serious trouble. The whiteout conditions had disoriented them. Nothing looked familiar. The GPS on his phone showed their position, but the landmarks he'd memorized were invisible behind the wall of snow. Then David screamed. Michael turned just in time to see his son disappear over an edge. The safety line went taut, yanking Michael forward. He threw himself backward, ice axe buried in the snow, arresting their fall. For 30 seconds, that felt like 30 years. Michael held on, every muscle in his body screaming, while the rope creaked ominously. "David, can you hear me?" "I'm okay." The voice came from below, shaky but alive. "There's a ledge. I think it's a cave." Using every technique he'd learned in mountain rescue training, Michael lowered himself over the edge. 20 feet down, he found David on a wide ledge that led into a shallow ice cave, a crevasse that had been carved by wind and water over centuries. They crawled inside, out of the screaming wind. Michael's hands shook as he checked David for injuries. Miraculously, the teenager had only bruises. "We're alive," David said, and Michael heard the disbelief in his voice. "We're alive," Michael confirmed, "and we're going to stay that way." If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. The ice cave became their sanctuary and their prison. It extended back about 15 feet into the mountain, with a ceiling high enough to sit up but not stand. The opening faced away from the prevailing wind, which meant they were protected from the worst of the storm, but it also meant snow rapidly accumulated at the entrance. Michael's first priority was inventory. He emptied both packs methodically, laying out their supplies in the dim light filtering through the cave mouth. 4 days of freeze-dried meals, 2 fuel canisters for the stove, a water filtration system, useless when everything was frozen, first aid kit, emergency bivy sacks, 50 feet of climbing rope, ice screws and carabiners, a satellite phone with a cracked screen that refused to power on despite Michael's increasingly desperate attempts. "How bad is it?" David asked, watching his father's face. Michael chose honesty. "We've got 4 days of food if we ration carefully, maybe 6 if we stretch it. The sat phone's dead, probably damaged when you fell, but we've got the emergency beacon. He pulled out the personal locator beacon, a bright yellow device about the size of a thick smartphone. His thumb hovered over the activation switch. "Why aren't you pressing it?" David asked. "Because once I do, we're committed. Search and rescue will come, but in these conditions, it could take them days to reach us, and they'll be putting their lives at risk." Michael looked at his son. "The weather report said this storm would last 36 hours. If we can wait it out, we might be able to self-rescue." David nodded slowly. "So we wait." "We wait," Michael confirmed. But he didn't activate the beacon yet. Something in his gut told him to hold off, to preserve that option for when they truly had no other choice. They spent the rest of day 6 setting up their shelter inside the cave. They spread their sleeping pads on the ice floor, which was uncomfortable but dry. Michael rigged a tarp across part of the cave opening, creating a windbreak while still allowing ventilation. Carbon monoxide from the stove could kill them as surely as the cold. Outside, the storm raged. The temperature continued to drop. Michael's thermometer, clipped to the outside of his pack, read -63 Celsius when he checked it. At that temperature, metal became brittle, plastics cracked, and human tissue froze in minutes. "Tell me we're going to be okay," David said that night, his voice small in the darkness. Michael wanted to lie, to offer easy comfort. Instead, he said, "We're going to do everything right. We're going to stay warm, stay fed, and stay smart. That's all we can control." They huddled together in one sleeping bag for warmth, a technique called buddy bagging that Michael had learned in survival training. David's body heat helped, but Michael could still feel the cold creeping in, making his fingers and toes ache. Day 7 brought no relief. If anything, the storm intensified. Wind speeds exceeded 80 miles per hour, creating a sound like a freight train that never passed. Snow had completely covered their cave entrance, which was both blessing and curse. It insulated them from the wind, but also meant they were essentially buried alive. Michael used his ice axe to carefully carve a ventilation hole through the snow, ensuring they had fresh air. Then he fired up the stove to melt snow for water. They each drank a liter, forcing down the liquid even though their bodies craved food more than hydration. "We need to stay disciplined about water," Michael explained. "Dehydration kills faster than hunger up here." For breakfast, they split one freeze-dried meal between them. David ate slowly, making each bite last, and Michael felt a surge of pride at his son's composure. To pass the time, they talked, really talked, in a way they hadn't since before the divorce. David told him about his fears of college applications, about feeling caught between his parents' different expectations, about how he sometimes felt like he was disappointing everyone. "You could never disappoint me," Michael said. "You're here, aren't you? You trained for months. You didn't quit when things got hard. That's not disappointment. That's the opposite. Mom thinks you're trying to turn me into a mini version of you," David said quietly. Michael was silent for a long moment. "Is that what you think?" "I don't know. Sometimes, maybe. But also, I like it. I like learning this stuff. I like feeling capable." "Then that's what matters," Michael said. "Not what your mother thinks or what I think. What you want." By day 8, Michael had to face reality. The storm wasn't passing. The wind had shifted, now blowing directly into their cave. Snow accumulated faster than he could clear it. They were burning through their fuel supply, having to run the stove more frequently to melt snow and maintain body temperature. He activated the beacon. The device sent out a distress signal containing their GPS coordinates, broadcasting on emergency frequencies monitored by search and rescue teams worldwide. But Michael knew the harsh truth. No helicopter could fly in these conditions. No rescue team could safely climb to their position. They were on their own until the weather cleared. "How long?" David asked when Michael told him. "I don't know. Could be tomorrow. Could be a week." That night, David's injured hand started showing signs of infection despite Michael's best efforts. The skin around the cut had become red and warm to the touch. Michael cleaned it again, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it in fresh gauze, but he could see the worry in his son's eyes. "It's going to be fine," Michael assured him, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Day 9 tested them in ways Michael hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the physical hardship, the hunger, the cold, the aching muscles. It was the psychological weight. The cave felt smaller every hour. The darkness felt deeper. The cold felt more personal, like it had singled them out for punishment. David became quiet, withdrawn. He spent hours staring at the cave wall, and when Michael tried to engage him in conversation, he received only one-word answers. "Talk to me," Michael finally said. "What's going on in your head?" "I'm just thinking about all the things I should have said," David replied. "To Mom, to Emma, to you. Should have? We're not dead, David, but we could be. We could die here and nobody would find us until spring." David's voice cracked. "And I never told Mom I forgive her for the divorce. I never told Emma I like her. I never told you that you're the bravest person I know." Michael pulled his son close. "Listen to me. We are getting out of here. And when we do, you're going to tell them all of that. But don't talk like this is the end. It's not." But privately, Michael was beginning to have his own doubts. The temperature had dropped to -69°C, colder than anywhere on Earth except Antarctica. They were down to 2 days of food. David's hand was definitely infected, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. That night, Michael lay awake listening to his son's labored breathing and wondered if he'd made a fatal mistake bringing David on this trip. If they died here, it would be his fault. His ego, his need to prove something, his stubborn belief that he could handle anything nature threw at him. He thought about Jennifer, who would never forgive him. He thought about the search and rescue teams who would eventually find their frozen bodies. He thought about all the things he wished he'd done differently, but mostly, he thought about the sunrise he was determined to show his son. Day 10 was coming, and with it, something neither of them expected. Leave a comment below about what you think happens next. Michael woke to silence. After 9 days of wind that never stopped, never even paused, the absence of sound was disorienting. He lay still in his sleeping bag, listening, wondering if he'd gone deaf or if this was hypothermia playing tricks with his senses. Then he heard it, David's breathing steady and calm, the distant crack of ice settling, the soft hiss of wind, but not the roaring monster that had trapped them. The storm had broken. Michael unzipped the sleeping bag carefully, trying not to wake his son. Every movement hurt. His muscles had atrophied from days of inactivity and inadequate calories. His fingers were stiff. The skin on his face felt tight and frozen. But he was alive, and so was David, and the wind had stopped. He crawled to the cave entrance and began digging through the snow that had accumulated during the night. It took 20 minutes of work before he broke through, and when he did, the sight that greeted him stole his breath. The world had been transformed. The storm had resculpted the entire landscape. Where there had been gentle slopes, now there were knife-edge ridges. Where there had been paths, now there were walls of snow. And above it all, a sky of such deep blue it looked painted. Michael checked his thermometer, -65°C. The temperature had risen slightly, but not enough to make travel safe. Still, the wind had dropped to nearly nothing, and visibility extended for miles. For the first time in days, he could see the route down. "Dad?" Michael turned to find David awake, looking at him with hollow eyes. The teenager had lost weight. They both had. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked and bleeding despite the lip balm they'd been applying religiously. "The storm's over," Michael said. David crawled forward to look outside. For a long moment he just stared at the transformed landscape. Then he said, "Can we make it down?" Michael wanted to say yes. Every instinct screamed at him to pack up and start moving immediately, but he'd spent 15 years learning to override instinct with analysis, emotion with logic. "I don't know," he admitted. "The avalanche danger is going to be extreme. All that new snow on top of ice, and we're weak. One mistake, and we're done. So we stay here. I'm thinking it through. Give me a minute. Michael pulled out his map, though he'd memorized every detail days ago. Their position was marked by the GPS coordinates the beacon had transmitted. Base camp was approximately 8 miles away, most of it downhill, but crossing terrain that was now fundamentally changed by the storm. If they stayed, they had perhaps 2 more days of food. David's hand infection was worsening. The skin was now bright red and hot to the touch, and Michael had seen him wince every time he moved it. Without antibiotics, that infection could spread to his bloodstream. Sepsis at this altitude, in these conditions, was a death sentence. If they tried to descend and failed, if an avalanche caught them, if they fell into a crevasse, if they simply exhausted themselves and couldn't continue, they'd die faster than if they'd stayed put. But staying meant waiting for rescue that might not come for days or weeks. The beacon was transmitting, but Michael had no way of knowing if anyone had received the signal or if rescue teams were even attempting to reach them. We go, Michael decided. We pack everything we can carry, we move slowly and carefully, and we get down this mountain. They spent an hour preparing. Every movement was deliberate. They melted snow and drank as much water as their stomachs could hold. They ate their second-to-last freeze-dried meal, splitting it 50-50, despite Michael wanting to give David the larger portion. They packed the rope, the ice screws, the first aid kit. Michael redressed David's hand wound. The infection had definitely worsened overnight. The skin was now showing the early signs of cellulitis, red streaks radiating from the wound. "I'm not going to lie to you," Michael said. "This is serious. We need to get you to a hospital." "I know," David said quietly. "I can feel it, like it's hot and cold at the same time." They emerged from the cave at 9:47 a.m. The sun was bright enough to require sunglasses, and the reflection off the snow was blinding. Michael tied them together with 30 feet of rope, just like he had on the ascent. If one of them fell, the other could arrest the fall. "Stay behind me," Michael instructed. "Step exactly where I step. If I say stop, you freeze. If I say run, you run. Understand?" "I understand." They began descending. The first hour went better than Michael had dared hope. The new snow was deep but stable, and they made steady progress. Michael used his ice axe to probe ahead, testing each step before committing his weight. Behind him, David matched his pace, trusting his father's judgment completely. Then they heard it, a sound like thunder, but different, deeper, more primal. "Avalanche!" Michael screamed. "Run left, now!" They scrambled laterally across the slope as a wall of snow roared down the mountain 200 yards to their right. It was massive, carrying enough force to pulverize anything in its path. Michael and David stood frozen, watching it pass, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. When it was over, when the snow had settled and the sound had faded, David said, "That was close." "Too close," Michael agreed. But internally he was calculating. The avalanche had been triggered by the warming temperatures and the weight of new snow, which meant there would be more. The entire mountain was unstable. They continued descending, but now Michael moved even more cautiously. Every step was a gamble. Every slope a potential death trap. The sun climbed higher, warming the snow, making it heavier and more prone to sliding. At noon, they stopped to rest. Michael checked his GPS. They'd covered 2 miles, 6 more to go. At this pace, assuming no major obstacles, they could reach base camp by nightfall, but that assumption proved optimistic. An hour later, they reached a section where the storm had completely changed the terrain. What had been a gentle traverse was now a steep slope of wind-packed snow leading to a cliff edge. The route they'd taken on the way up was gone, erased by the storm. Michael studied the slope, looking for alternatives. He could see a path, narrow, dangerous, but possible. It required crossing about 60 feet of exposed terrain, where a fall would be catastrophic. "I'm going to set up a fixed line," he told David. I'll cross first, anchor the rope on the other side, then you follow using the rope for security." It took 30 minutes to set up properly. Michael drove 2 ice screws into the solid ice beneath the surface snow, clipped the rope through them, then began his traverse. Every step was calculated. He kept 3 points of contact at all times, 2 feet and his ice axe, or 2 tools and 1 foot. Halfway across, his foot broke through the crust. For a heart-stopping moment, he felt himself falling, but his ice axe held. He hung there, suspended over the void, before pulling himself back up onto the slope. He didn't look back at David, couldn't let his son see the fear on his face. When he reached the other side, he anchored the rope and waved for David to follow. The teenager clipped into the line and began crossing, using the rope for balance and security. Michael could see his son's fear in every movement, but David didn't hesitate, didn't freeze up. "That's it," Michael called encouragingly. "Just like we practiced, 1 step at a time." David made it across. They hugged briefly, a quick, fierce embrace, before continuing. By mid-afternoon, they were exhausted. Michael called for another rest, and they sat on their packs, sharing the last of their food. A single freeze-dried meal split between them, barely enough to quiet their growling stomachs. "Dad," David said suddenly, "I hear something." Michael listened. At first he heard nothing but the wind. Then he caught it, a distant, rhythmic sound. Mechanical, regular. "Helicopter," he breathed. They looked up, scanning the sky. There, a black dot against the blue, growing larger. A rescue helicopter following the beacon signal. Michael pulled out his emergency mirror and began flashing it, trying to catch the pilot's attention. David waved his arms frantically, but the helicopter was still miles away, and Michael couldn't tell if they'd been spotted. The aircraft circled their area for 10 minutes that felt like hours. Then, to their crushing disappointment, it turned and flew away. "No," David whispered. No, come back." "They saw us," Michael said, trying to sound certain. "They're probably going back for equipment or looking for a safe place to land." But he wasn't certain, not at all. They continued descending as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped rapidly, and with it, their spirits. They were weak, hungry, and David's infection was getting worse. Michael had noticed his son shivering even when they were moving, a sign that his body's ability to regulate temperature was compromised. As darkness fell, Michael had to make another impossible decision. They were still 4 miles from base camp, too far to reach in darkness across unfamiliar avalanche-prone terrain. But stopping meant another night in the open, burning calories they didn't have to maintain body temperature. He chose to stop. They found a sheltered spot beneath an ice overhang and set up their bivy sacks. No tent, no stove. They'd left those behind to save weight, just thin emergency blankets and each other's body heat. "I'm sorry," Michael said as they huddled together. "I'm sorry I brought you here. I'm sorry I put you in danger." "Stop," David said firmly. "I chose to come, and I'd choose it again. Even now. Especially now." David was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've learned more about myself in the last 10 days than in the last 10 years. I've learned I'm stronger than I thought. I've learned that fear doesn't have to paralyze me. I've learned what really matters." Michael felt tears freezing on his cheeks. What matters? This. Us. Being here together. Everything else, grades, college, what mom wants, what anyone expects, it's all just noise. This is real. They fell silent, conserving energy. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. Michael's thermometer read -68 Celsius, 1 degree away from the coldest it had been. That night, Michael dreamed of his father, who died when Michael was 20. In the dream, they were climbing together, and his father was telling him something important, something he needed to remember. But when Michael woke, gasping, disoriented, he couldn't recall what it was. Beside him, David was mumbling in his sleep, delirious with fever from the infection. Day 10 wasn't over yet, and neither was their ordeal. Michael woke to David screaming. He jolted upright in the grey pre-dawn light to find his son thrashing in his bivy sack, eyes wide but unseeing. Fever had taken hold completely. David's face was flushed red against the white of the snow, and when Michael pressed his hand to his son's forehead, the heat was alarming. "David, look at me. Focus on my voice." But David was somewhere else, trapped in a fever dream. He mumbled about Emma, about finishing the climb, about his mother. His words were disjointed, panicked. Michael knew with absolute certainty that they were out of time. If he didn't get David to medical care within hours, the infection would kill him. No more careful descents, no more waiting for ideal conditions. They had to move now, regardless of the danger. He forced water down David's throat, supporting his son's head. Then he packed their gear with shaking hands. Everything non-essential got left behind. All that mattered was speed. When he tried to get David on his feet, the teenager could barely stand. His legs buckled, and only Michael's grip kept him upright. "David, I need you to walk. Can you do that for me?" "Tired, Dad. So tired." "I know, but we have to move. Please." They started down the mountain with David leaning heavily on Michael's shoulder. Their pace was agonizingly slow. Every 100 yards required rest. Every slope required Michael to practically carry his son. The sun rose, indifferent to their suffering. The temperature climbed to -60°C. Still cold enough to kill, but Michael barely noticed. All his focus was on David, on keeping him moving, keeping him conscious. 3 miles to base camp. At 8 a.m., David collapsed. He simply stopped walking and crumpled to the snow. Michael tried to revive him, but David's eyes rolled back in his head. "No," Michael said. "Not like this. Not when we're so close." He did the only thing he could think of. He fashioned a makeshift sled using their rope and sleeping pads, loaded David onto it, and began dragging him down the mountain. Every muscle in Michael's body screamed in protest. His back, already strained from days of tension and cold, felt like it would snap. His legs, weak from malnutrition, threatened to give out with every step. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. 2 miles to base camp. At 10 a.m., Michael heard the helicopter again. This time it was close, very close. He looked up to see it hovering just a few 100 yards away, the downwash from its rotors creating a snow tornado. A figure appeared in the open door, then rappelled down on a line. The rescuer wore a red jumpsuit and carried a medical pack. As he approached, Michael recognized the patch on his shoulder, Alaska Mountain Rescue Group. "I've got you," the rescuer shouted over the rotor noise. "We've got you both." Michael collapsed to his knees as the rescuer reached them. "My son, he's infected, needs antibiotics, We know, we're prepared. Just let us do our job." A second rescuer descended. Together they assessed David quickly, efficiently. One started an IV line, while the other radioed the helicopter. Within minutes, a rescue basket was being lowered. They loaded David first. Michael watched his unconscious son being lifted into the helicopter, and only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of relief. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, they'd survived. When the basket came back down for Michael, he was so exhausted he could barely climb into it. As he was lifted toward the helicopter, he looked down at the mountain that had nearly killed them. From up here, it looked beautiful and serene, giving no hint of the hell it contained. Inside the helicopter, a paramedic was already working on David. She'd administered antibiotics and was monitoring his vital signs. "Is he going to be okay?" Michael asked. "We got to him in time," she assured him. "The infection is serious but treatable. He's young and strong. He'll recover." Michael closed his eyes as the helicopter banked toward anchorage. The sound of the rotors was hypnotic, and he felt himself drifting toward unconsciousness. But before he slipped under, he heard the pilot's voice over the intercom. "You know, we almost didn't come back. The weather window was closing and command was ready to call off the search until conditions improved. But your beacon kept transmitting, and something told me to make one more pass." "What changed?" Michael asked. "Honestly, I don't know. Just a feeling, like something was telling me you two weren't done yet. In the hospital in Anchorage, Michael spent 3 days recovering from severe frostbite, dehydration, and exhaustion. He lost 2 toes on his left foot and the tips of 3 fingers on his right hand. The doctors said he was lucky. It could have been much worse. David spent a week in the ICU fighting the infection that had spread to his bloodstream. But the teenager was indeed strong, and with aggressive antibiotic treatment, he pulled through. His hand healed, though he would always have a scar from the cut that had nearly killed him. Jennifer flew up from Seattle the moment she heard. Michael expected anger, recrimination, blame. Instead, when she walked into his hospital room, she simply sat down beside his bed and cried. "I thought I'd lost both of you," she said. "I'm sorry," Michael told her. "You were right. It was reckless. I put our son in danger because of my ego." But Jennifer shook her head. "That's not what David said. He said you saved his life. He said you never gave up on him. What else could I do? He's my son." Most people would have activated that beacon on day 1. You lasted 9 days because you taught him to be strong, to endure. That's not ego, Michael. That's love. When David was finally well enough for visitors, Emma came. Michael watched from the doorway as the teenage girl sat beside his son's bed, holding his unbandaged hand, telling him about everything he'd missed at school. "I'm glad you're okay," Emma said. "When I heard what happened, I was so scared." "I'm glad I'm okay too," David replied. Then, with a courage that clearly terrified him more than any mountain, he added, "I like you, Emma. I should have told you before." She smiled. "I know. I like you too." Michael quietly left them alone. 3 weeks later, when they were both released from the hospital, Michael and David flew back to Seattle. On the flight, David was quiet, staring out the window at the mountains passing below. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked. "About what you asked me on day 9. If I thought you were trying to turn me into a mini version of yourself. And I think you were trying to show me who I could be. There's a difference." David turned to look at his father. "I'm not you, Dad. I'm probably never going to be a wilderness guide or summit Denali. But I know now that I'm capable of more than I thought. That fear is just information, not a stop sign. That's all I ever wanted you to learn," Michael said. "But here's the thing, I want to try again. Not Denali, not in winter, but something. A different mountain, a different season, with better planning and proper support. Because we didn't fail up there, we survived. And I want to remember what that feels like." Michael felt pride swell in his chest. "You sure?" "I'm sure. But next time, we tell Mom first." They both laughed at that. The thing that happened on day 10, the thing no one expected, wasn't dramatic or supernatural. It wasn't a miracle or divine intervention. It was simply this: 2 people refusing to quit. A father who dragged his dying son down a mountain because the alternative was unthinkable. A son who held on to consciousness through fever and pain because he trusted his father completely. And a rescue team that made one more pass when common sense said to turn back. Sometimes survival isn't about the big moments. It's about 1,000 small decisions. To keep moving when stopping would be easier. To share the last of the food evenly. To stay awake 1 more hour. To take 1 more step. The mountain had tested them to their absolute limits and found them unbreakable. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were human in the truest sense. Flawed, scared, but unwilling to surrender. 6 months later, Michael received a package in the mail. Inside was a photo of David and Emma at prom, both smiling, both happy. On the back, David had written, "Thanks for showing me I'm strong enough. Planning our next trip. Maybe something warmer this time. Love you, Dad." Michael put the photo on his desk, next to the frostbitten gloves he'd kept as a reminder. Not of the cold, or the fear, or the pain, but of what mattered most. Family, endurance, love. The mountain had taught them well. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing your reactions and answering your questions. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.